Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth session of Recycled Architecture virtual talk series. Last week's session with Wael Awar was quite inspiring as we learned about his interesting projects, including the upcoming UAE Pavilion at the Venice Biennale 2021. I'm confident this week's session will be equally interesting. These talks are hosted by the Middle East innovation leader and pioneering force for sustainability, BIA, in collaboration with Khazan Park. BIA's ventures range from waste management and renewable energy to sustainable transportation and environmental consultancy. Their new headquarters is set to launch at the end of this year, is an architectural marvel and by far the office of the future that emulates the company's twin-pillared strategy of sustainability and digitalization. Today, we are delighted to talk to the director of CAAD Labs and associate professor at the American University of Sharjah, Ammar Kalo. His work interrogates the relationship between digital technology and traditional craft. During the inaugural Dubai Design Week 2015, he was selected by Harper's Bazaar Interiors as a recipient of the Emerging Designer Award for that year. In 2016, the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York has acquired two pieces from him, Stratum and N-Bowl, for its permanent collection. Important notice to our audience, please feel free to ask questions in the comments on BIA's YouTube channel. We are live on it now, and I will make sure to read them to our speaker at the end. Now, before we delve into our main question, Ammar, please tell us a little bit about your journey thus far and what really inspired you to do what you do.
So first of all, thank you, George, and thanks to BIA and Khazan Park for hosting me today. It's a great pleasure to talk to you today and to everyone listening and watching on YouTube. So my journey basically began when I studied architecture obtained my bachelor degrees in architecture a long time ago. After that, I worked in Dubai for a number of years in an architectural firm, sort of like a corporate style office, and worked on a number of different projects of different scales. So hospitals, actually I worked on CAAD, the Cleveland Clinic in Abu Dhabi, metro stations and all sorts of projects. But at some point I needed something a bit more specific to kind of delve into. And that's when I decided to go and do my master's at the University of Michigan. And I did a Master of Science in Architecture, which is a post-professional degree at the College of Architecture and Urban Planning. And it specializes in digital technology and material systems. And that's when I started my kind of journey into looking at ways of using digital technology in design and architecture and sort of manufacturing and marrying the two and trying to figure out basically what my kind of work agenda might be from there on. And then at some point, currently, I work at the American University of Sharjah, as you mentioned. I'm the director of labs and associate professor at the College of Architecture, where kind of I do a lot of creative work and research in the area of furniture design, interior design, and small-scale architecture. And it's all focused basically on using digital technology and trying to synthesize that with some sort of craft.
Fantastic. Ammar, can you tell us what is your philosophy on the role of recycling in design and how do you apply that in your projects?
I think when we talk about recycling in design or architecture, we kind of forget to mention the 3 R's typically in like the logo that you find for recycling, which is kind of reuse, reduce, reuse, and recycle. So those 2 parts are often forgotten. So any chance we get to reuse scrap materials and kind of use them in an adaptive new way, that's always a chance to kind of save on wasting any new kind of virgin material on that project. So that's always something that we need to look at. The other thing is reuse and rethink the approach to how one selects materials and uses them. So when it comes to projects that are a little bit more focused on sustainability and environmental design, I always tend to try to see where the materials come from, what the source is, what the waste stream kind of looks like in general. Study that and try to figure out how we can approach those projects in a very specific way that tells a story about the materials and how they could be used. So every project is a story. If it's a furniture piece, I try to design it in a way that talks about how at least the material wants to behave and kind of form the kind of aesthetics around that, but also try to research how we could use, let's say, recycled materials in that sense and integrate them into the project. But at a kind of macro level, I think it's essential before thinking about recycling, looking at a kind of circular economy and figuring out waste before starting a project to see how one could reduce waste, eliminate waste, or at least reuse as much material as possible. So it becomes important to establish that and then resort to some sort of recycling, because once you get to kind of the concept of recycling, obviously there's a ton of materials and precious resources that are around, whether we're talking about plastic or rubber or cloth or whatever it may be. I mean, there are giant industries where a very kind of minute percentage of those products end up in recycled products. So if we talk about the fabric industry, for example, only I think 5% of garments end up being shredded and reused to create new threads, whereas 90 to 95% end up in a landfill, and that's quite a waste. And it's the same across many industries. So how do we kind of tap into that waste stream along the way before it gets to the landfill and try to figure out kind of a way to intervene into the process and develop processes that at least use the material provided with a second life and try to create work around that. So I think that's how I think about these issues.
Okay, fantastic. Does recycling mean automatically sustainable for you? Where does your practice stand with regards to both?
I mean, one can say yes, it is, but it's also much more nuanced than that. So if we also refer back to the previous answer that I was just talking about, it's how to essentially, how does one gather all this material and use it in a sustainable way, which means you're trying to reduce as much waste as much as possible, use as the least amount of energy possible, and basically harm the environment the least. So if you can eliminate all of that, that would be kind of a great starting point. So I think, does recycling automatically mean it's sustainable? It might be, but I think it goes beyond that, and look at all the different facets of kind of setting up a circular economy around these materials and figure out a way to extract these precious kind of resources from the waste stream into an economy that gets some use out of these materials and get value out of what is regarded as waste. So I think where, in relationship to my practice, it's mostly, so in most of the projects, I'm not, and I'm just going to start sharing my screen and go through some of these projects.
Yes, please do. Please do.
So in most of the kind of projects that I kind of start to work on, it's identifying a kind of single material that I could at least start using, and then finding ways to use that material in a project that could start to at least provide not so much a permanent solution, but at least a kind of an idea of how one might start to reuse the material. Obviously, there's some limitations in the processes that get used. So in this instance, there's some kind of resin which could be replaced with a bioplastic, for example. But it's all about, I think, the process and the way to go and rethink how these products get integrated into some sort of product. So I'm I don't claim to have kind of perfect solutions of how these things, how these materials are supposed to be recycled. I think it's mostly the aim is to provide something that's functional, that works, that is kind of aesthetically, along the same lines of the rest of my work, but also kind of, provide some sort of direction as to how they could be integrated in a design sense. Most of kind of recycled projects tend to be kind of arts and craft based, where they're just materials cobbled together and not as much transformed. So I think it's mostly about taking those various different materials, wherever they can come from, and trying to see what I could do to highlight the material itself. So highlight where it came from, what the qualities of those materials are, and at the same time produce something that's unique and also has its own design story to tell. So I think in most instances, and most of the projects that I'll be showing today, all of them actually, are projects that start with that idea. Obviously have a lot more work that is not, let's say, in the same vein, but there's a common thread between all the projects that I worked on that do look into different ways of reusing kind of waste or reusing recycled material, like fabric in their previous example, or like we see over here, these are crushed aluminum bales. You can see the profiles in the background, which come from building sites. So any sites that are kind of torn down, or from factories that are trashing, building aluminum profiles for windows, those get crushed into the cubes that we see in the foreground. And typically those go straight to the foundry, where they get remelted and kind of extruded into new profiles. But what I did here is look at how I can use the material to draw kind of some sort of awareness to the fact that you've got also metals that could be recycled and used. It's not just about plastics and rubbers. Everything that we produce at an industrial scale has to have some sort of waste stream. So this is not a solution to kind of recycle the material. And in a sense, I stopped it on the way to the foundry to get remelted. But when this project is done, it could be easily recycled because the material itself hasn't been altered that much, and it's still the same virgin material. And by cutting through the material and showing the internal workings of the patterns that are produced by this crushed process, it kind of gives it a sense of this texture that is almost being revealed in the only way it can be, by slicing it. And the color choices over here are to highlight that. So wherever it's sliced, it's left as the original material, and wherever it's shaped to kind of produce this log form, is painted in blue. This project was commissioned by BIA during Dubai Design Week 2018, and it was a public seating project and a table for the public, and it was displayed there throughout the week, and now it's somewhere next to BIA's building in El Sharjah. So yeah, that's how I think about the materials in relationship to the projects and what the role of recycling is.
Okay, beautiful, amazing. Then, of course, when one thinks about recycling, the first topic that comes to one's mind is material. But Ammar, if we keep materials on a side, can you see a way where design can be recycled?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, especially when it comes to large spaces in architecture, I think reusing space, so going back to kind of the idea of reusing and kind of chain adaptability of certain projects. If it's an old building, instead of tearing it down, kind of wasting all that material, it'll be better to rehabilitate that project, refurbish it in a way that changes its use. So I think the best example recently that we've seen in Sharjah is the Flying Saucer, which is an old building that kind of has its unique shape, but instead of being torn down for new development, it's been preserved, and the function changed from whatever it used to be, a supermarket or a gas station, to now a kind of really interesting gallery with very kind of high quality exhibition. So I think that kind of thinking towards spaces, towards even interior design, too often shops, being an economy over here with a lot of retail presence, shops open up and close very often, and whatever material has been used for these fit outs gets thrown away. So I think there has to be a concerted effort to actively go into these sites and salvage whatever is possible and find ways to reuse them, whether they can be integrated into other projects and dismantled and taken down and kind of reconfigured in some fashion, or whether the raw material is usable enough to do something with that. And I think the trouble with kind of looking at material in relationship to construction waste is that it's really hard to separate. So to avoid that altogether, I think reusing the entire space or rethinking how that's done, I think would be interesting. Some of the examples, even internationally, of in the Netherlands, there's this aquarium, I think, indoor aquarium or a zoo that's been kind of converted into a center for startups to look into sustainable kind of initiatives. So the entire space gets reused in the spirit of kind of reusing architecture itself and kind of readapting what the space looks like. Amazon is doing the same thing with malls that are dead right now. They're going in there and converting it into warehouses. So I think there's a lot of energy spent and materials, obviously, on building large projects, architectural projects, interior space, and a lot of kind of time and money has been spent. So I think the best way would be to always find a way to reuse architecture, interior design, furniture, whatever the kind of field is, before we think about recycling. Because the moment we do that and everything's demolished and we have a sea of mixed waste, then the problem is just multiplied. Obviously, sometimes we have to demolish certain parts, but I think as much as possible, keeping in mind how space is always flexible and adaptive, and it's not necessarily that one designs a building and that remains as is. Obviously, our architects have a very strong intention and spend a lot of time designing spaces to serve very specific functions, but that doesn't mean that those spaces can't be readapted into other functions. And in that design process, thinking about what materials get used, how the spaces could be flexible in the future, I think embedding that in the design process itself would help a lot in the kind of the afterlife of the building, if you will.
And Ammar, I think, also when you showed us the bench, I mean, I think, architects, when we think about space, we don't only think, just big spaces. We also think, all scale, everything is space for us. And, when it was very nice. You told us this was exhibited here, but now it's moved and it's now put in another place. I mean, that's also a type of getting one design and moving it from one place to another. It's kind of also of reusing that design. So I appreciated that very much. If we, let's say if we go back to the material, and I understand you said you should not separate, but if we go back to the materials, so what materials in your designs and how these materials affect and define your design process and product? So what are the materials in your design usually used? Can you talk a little bit more detail about this?
I think before I start any project, especially if it's furniture pieces in this case, what I'm showing is mostly furniture pieces at that scale and trying to figure out solutions over there. So I think before I start any of these projects, I need to know two things. So what the function is going to be and what the material is. Without those two things, I can't really design, right? It's part of my design process. I need to have these two bits of information before I do anything. Otherwise, it could be anything, and the design process for me becomes a bit too fluid and kind of too open. Like I'm not too sure what I'm trying to achieve. But once I know it's going to be, a table or whatever the project is. So in this case, we're looking at also another project sponsored by BF for Design Week 2017. It was displayed at downtown Dubai. It was Design Days at those years. So these was displayed at Design Days, and the idea was to create a series of stools that are made out of rubber and some other material. So the image that I'm showing you right now is the beginning of that process. I have an idea of what I'm trying to create. It's some sort of seating, and I know what the material is. So I think without those two, the process becomes unmoored, and it could be anything. So with these available over here, so I know it's a seating and the material, then the process becomes about, okay, if I know what the material is, what can I do with that material? If it's new, for example, recycled tires over here, rubber crumb, and how can I form it to express what the material does typically. So in this case, you can probably see in the top right corner, the red brick. That's one of the tiles that BM makes using this rubber crumb. So the idea was all to try different mixtures, different ratios of rubber to the binder, different colors, and how those would attach to another material. And then from there, the form and the design aesthetic organically grows from that. So it's all about trying different combinations of materials and colors and textures and kind of different finishes. And at this point, I'm not quite sure what the product is going to be formally. I just know it's going to be rubber and it's going to be a seat. And taking the time to actually go through this exploration process is essential, because I'm trying to understand what the material can and cannot do, and use those qualities to express them in some formal manner. So this is the end product, and you can see the bottom side of the stool kind of takes the shape of the cross wooden pieces. So it kind of organically molds itself around it. The stool itself was made using a two-part mold, kind of the same way that the tiles were made. So I'm trying to adapt that same process, but use it in a slightly different way and refine it by adding a little bit more material and character to the design. So in this instance, these are called macaroon seats, and they're basically called that because the edge where you see this brass line that defines the two meeting points also happens to be where the material is most fuzzy and kind of broken down, kind of like a macaroon, where it gets its name from. So it's mostly about showing the quality of this material and its moldability. And you can see also here these chips that are added in there that provide the speckled visual texture. But these are also a waste product from the manufacturing process of kind of cutting the wood pieces. So the wood shavings are added into the mix, and you can see what the mold looks like in this instance. And it's put as a wet mix with some binder, and the skeleton of the chair is placed in there and essentially pressed with the two sides with rubber in there. And then once it comes out, essentially it looks something like this. Obviously, there's a bunch of post-processing afterwards, but it all came down to how to best express the qualities of this material physically, while also at the same time respecting the physical, basically limitations of the material, and not trying to force it to do something that it doesn't want to do. So these are just some final images of the product, and adding the brass piece highlights the seam between the two parts and also refines it a little bit more. And you can see how the rubber wraps around the wood as it jets out from the body, and it's all smooth. There are no corners, and that's mostly to express kind of its organic and soft nature to the work.
Ammar, sorry to interrupt you, but do you have an idea of the durability of this? I mean, for how long, for example, this piece can last?
So that's something I'd actually love to know. Designing this project was a way to show what we can do with rubber crumb besides tiles. So kind of working on a different product and showing that this could be also something that could be done with the same material that BIA provided. But I think, if this goes into production, for example, obviously there has to be some tests done to how durable and how robust it would be. But at a first glance, I would say it's as robust as the tile would be, because it's using the same binder, it's using the same process, more or less. The tile is compressed in a heated steel mold, so it kind of cures the binder much quicker. I didn't have that, obviously. You saw a plywood mold, so that takes a lot of time. It's just the pressure that keeps it together. But I think in general, it should be durable enough because of the way it's been pressed in the binder. And it would have to be sealed in some way because this is an interior product and it's not sitting outside, just to prevent off-gassing. So there's a layer of thin kind of lacquer or sometimes this bioresin on top of it to keep it from off-gassing. But you're right, there definitely has to be studies done if this were to be kind of a commercial endeavor. But I think the whole idea is to demonstrate what other things can be done with the same materials besides tiles.
Okay, so yeah, please go ahead.
The next project is also part of the same series, using the same material, but this time thinking about it in a slightly different way. These were a series of tables that were done for Fikra Campus, in Sharjah, which is a co-working space in Sharjah, and an incubator for startups, design startups. So in here, the idea was to use it as a shell, a cover for these formed bodies around the wooden tables. So you can see that the rubber acts as a shell around this wood table, and the legs jet through in a similar manner through, and they're almost sliced at the top to show what the interior looks like. In my mind, it's as if you've got a big blob of rubber, but once you cut it, you open it up, it's like a watermelon. There's a completely different character to the inside. And this is one way to show that, by having the leg interact with the tabletop and also deform the rubber casing around that to express also its malleability. So these are just examples of the final piece and the way it's been kind of processed. Instead of molding it in kind of very specific rigid molds that are compressed, this was done freehand and packed by hand around the body to give it that bulbous kind of body. These are the almost bare wooden tables before they were added, before the rubber was added. And just a few more images of what the mess that this process creates looks like, essentially. But as an end result, I think it starts to communicate some of the same qualities that the macaroon stools did, which is having the rubber act as this very conceptually stretchy material that moves around the wooden pieces. So you can see here part of the legs coming up and how the rubber interacts with it. And that was the second project that I did with the rubber. And both of these, in talking about through the process of these projects, it's very similar to how I go about the rest of my projects, which is always having a material and a function and starting from there, and then experimenting with the materials and seeing what works and what doesn't, and trying to highlight those qualities, both visually, but also in a way that tells some sort of story beyond just using that material. So yeah, that's how I kind of work through my process.
Okay. So state for us one environmental opportunity and one challenge that you had to face while designing or constructing, a design or a project.
I think the challenge is always how to develop a process that's actually 100%, let's say, recyclable, 100% sustainable. There's always some sort of additive addition to the process. In this case, I'm showing pictures of another project, also commissioned by BIA, where I use crushed PVC pipes that are from drainage pipes, essentially, that are crushed. And what I tried to do with this is create some sort of surface that becomes a bench. So obviously, in this instance, I'm using resin, which we all know is not really recyclable. Once it cures, it's really hard to recycle. So I think the challenge is finding alternatives to these binders, finding alternatives to the different ways we kind of glue these materials together, perhaps natural binders or bioplastics. But the issue is always trying to figure out a process where that's as sustainable as possible. So even though I'm using waste material and PVC is slightly hard to melt down or recycle, I'm still trapping it in resin, right? So it's not, again, this is not a solution in any way possible, but it just highlights the use of a kind of wasted material, highlights the use of something that's essentially trashed into a functional piece, but by no means this is the solution to using kind of PVC plastic shards. So obviously finding ways to remelt them and create new virgin material would be the best way. In this instance, the wood is recycled from different projects and put together, but I think the challenge is how much can you do? And that takes a lot of time. So finding a natural binding material, its own research project. And I think I'd love to kind of start working on that, but it just so happened that at this moment, I haven't had the chance to.
But still, I mean, it's not only functional, it's beautiful. I mean, even the texture and the way that they come together with the wood, it's really fascinating. Okay, so what about opportunity?
Opportunity, I think for me, is what's exciting is looking at all these different materials that I've shown today and having the chance to work with BIA, work with others to get my hands on these materials that I wouldn't have otherwise, and just play around with them. So I really kind of love this project and the amount of experimentation I did for this to get this certain look, but also the rubber projects where I got to spend a month or two just looking at that material and trying to understand what it does, something I haven't worked with before, or the aluminum project. So it's always exciting for me to study this new material that I'm working with and figure out ways that I can highlight its use or highlight where it came from, the waste stream, or do something kind of interesting with it. So I think the opportunity is always giving myself that space where I can start to dig into the material and really work something out that works both aesthetically, but also starts to hint at some sort of process that it could be used in the future. I can imagine, and this is something that I started to work with for this particular project, instead of using resin, is trying to figure out a way to make a kind of mold made out of metal that I could put the plastic in and basically not melt them, but soften them until they weld themselves together. and just leave it at that. So there's no need for the binder. So using the properties of the material itself, but that obviously takes a lot more time than just using it in this manner. So yeah, I'd say the opportunity is getting to work with all sorts of materials and exploring projects that way.
Okay, so we have some questions from the audience. Would you like to continue the presentation, or you want me to go to the questions? Is there
still
go to the
questions. These are the last slides.
Oh, okay, perfect. So one of the questions is saying, and I'll try to understand me and you together. So how can we overcome society's disregard for waste as a material source?
Well, I think one of the goals with most of these projects that I had is to exactly address that, is to tell someone, this product that I designed, whether you think it's beautiful or not, that's irrelevant, but like this came from, X waste material. And like when I talk about the rubber stools, or when I talk about this, it's like this came from wasted drainage pipes, that had sewage or whatever had water in it, or the rubber crumb used to be tires for cars, and instead of using that as as is, it's been processed and recycled as a material, and then using that into a new product. So I think one of my goals is to actually demonstrate that just because it's a waste material doesn't mean that you can't do something with it. On the contrary, I think as we move along to the future and resources become more and more scarce and more kind of harder to, let's say, mine resources, or more expensive, both in terms of energy, but also cost to create new materials, then you'd realize that using the precious waste that we have, the waste streams, tap into those becomes essential. So I think, yeah, that's what has to be done.
Absolutely. So have you considered designing or introducing your work to the early education institutions in order to create early awareness among students?
In the early education system, I haven't done that, but in my teaching at the American University of Sharjah, I sometimes teach fabrication courses or furniture courses, and they're not so much focused on this topic or this aspect of design. It's mostly kind of basics of designing a piece of furniture. But I think, part of working on these projects and prototyping them at the school, in the labs where students and kind of faculty have access, and being there around students, I think having that direct connection to them hopefully shows them how certain things are done without being kind of explicitly taught. So kind of leading by example, if you will. But I do think that introducing at least the concepts of reusing, reducing waste, and recycling at a very early age are essential, whether they're done through design or just kind of general awareness campaigns, or very kind of basic activities where students get to recycle the plastic in the class, or the bottles, or whatever it may be. I think just at least introducing the concepts and reinforcing them is an essential part of this, so that students at a younger age have that ingrained in their minds that reuse and reducing waste is as important as recycling, because at some point there's a huge amount of waste that has to be recycled, and if we can reduce that waste in the first place, then that would be a better place to be in.
Okay, one more question, Ammar. Where do you source for recyclables to work with? I don't know, I'm trying to get around my head with that question. So I'll repeat, where do you source for recyclables to work with?
So I think what they mean by that is, where do I get my materials from? So in a lot of these projects, I source them from BIA. Since they commissioned the piece, they have different waste streams that are there, and kind of they generously provided the material. In other instances, I just kind of wander around the industrial area and try to find, for example, for the aluminum, I had to go and find a company that actually does the compacting for those bales, and work with them, or whether it's the wood that we're seeing over here. This is from the wood shop, from previous projects that I did. Different wastes gathered together, set aside, so that in the future, if I have something, I can use it. So this is what I did over here. So I think, whether there's a source or not, the intention of working using recycled material from the beginning, if that's what you have in mind, then you can go around and trace different waste streams in any industry. I mean, we can go to, I'm sure if we go to, let's say, I don't know, a meat packing company that, packs meat into small containers and sells them to Carrefour, for example, I'm sure they have some sort of waste stream that are there. I worked previously with a student on a independent study where she went and found a place in the industrial area that makes mattresses, foam mattresses, but then the waste is this kind of these foam crumbs that she used to cast aluminum pieces. So using kind of lost foam casting. So it's just about finding some sort of industry, studying what the process is, and then figuring out what the waste streams are and what those waste products are, and then seeing what you could do with those.
There's a continuation of this question saying that, have you explored using palm wood or damask or, something like that?
Palm wood, I haven't yet. It was something that I wanted to work with on a previous project. But I haven't gotten to actually do it. But yeah, I mean, there are a bunch of palm trees around that are just chopped up and dead in landfills that they don't know what to do with those except burn them for energy. I think that's also a valuable source of softwood that could be used. So whether it's appropriate for furniture or not, I think that's something to be determined. I think that it's hard enough. But yeah, it is a source of material that's around, and more importantly, it's not imported. So a lot of these hardwoods, especially the walnut that's being shown on the screen right now, it's imported from the US. So cutting it down in the US, harvesting that, cutting it into slabs, importing it to the UAE, and then selling it to a consumer, that takes a lot of energy and kind of, carbon, it has a carbon footprint. But if there's a dead palm tree somewhere that could be cut up and used in a new way instead of this wood, then yeah, I'm all for it.
Yeah. And this also, go back to your, aspiration of saying, try to make something totally sustainable, as much as possible.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Ammar, I just need you to stop sharing so that we can go to the closing thoughts. And then so you can tell us, any closing thoughts on design and recycling. And what do you think our audience should take away from this interesting talk?
So I'll start with the last portion of it. So I think the takeaway is not to say that these are solutions for kind of recycling and design, but they're just kind of prompts for people to, think about, I can do something like this, and then try to improve on the process. So I mentioned that when I talked about the resin and the kind of what could be done in its place. So they're mostly kind of thought-provoking projects that try to show people, relating to the question that we got first, about what you can do, what are the potentials of using what we call waste, but is actually a precious material and precious resource. But in general, I think, thinking about recycling, it's mostly still re-emphasizing the idea of reusing and reducing waste to begin with. And then when we get to recycling, trying to look at the entire waste process of any product or any industry, even at our homes, right? If we're using plastic bottles, can we switch to glass bottles? Look at the entire kind of ecosystem and trying to do the best we can to reduce that amount of waste. But also perhaps thinking about these things and embedding them in, from like a design point of view, embedding them in the design process, so that if I'm working on a project, I'm specifying a material for a building, and I had two choices. One, maybe, besides looking at the carbon footprint of like local versus imported, perhaps trying to see what the life of the product might be. So something that could decompose on its own versus something like concrete that's maybe harder to recycle. Or if it's two different types of wood, then what are the benefits of using this or that? Or something like a plastic, is there some sort of alternative for, let's say, a plastic sheet that's 100% recycled, made from recycled materials instead of buying a new sheet? So just trying to be actively aware of what the potential life cycle of the project is, and considering what materials we use, so that when it comes time to, hopefully 30, 50 years in the future, to demolish the project or reuse it, at least there's more than we currently have to work with. And that's because these things have been thought beforehand. Some of these ideas are implemented in, let's say, stadium designs. So it's kind of quite famous during the Olympics. Cities build large stadiums, and once that's done, they become abandoned. And the kind of new thought now with a lot of the stadiums is either make them dismantleable so that you can take it apart and re-erect it somewhere else, or turn it into like a mall or a residential project. So if that was done like from the very beginning, that it becomes much easier, and it sort of pays for the project in the long term, because at least the use for its life after its primary function is thought out, instead of having something that kind of is built and it just rots away. So yeah, I think just thinking about things holistically and embedding that that type of thinking in the design process from the beginning, so that we end up with promising results.
Okay, so all right, Ammar, thank you for this insightful and informative talk. Thank you all for tuning in, and please make sure to attend our next week talk with Asif Khan at the same time.
Thank you.
Thank you.